Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. My grandfather used to tell me this story. I began sitting around the fire with my grandchildren. He always made it clear that the names in the story were fictional, but what happened was very real. The crackling fire seemed to dim as I started the tale, my voice growing soft. It all began with a simple mission during the Vietnam War. Deep in the jungle near an abandoned village, in the humid jungle of Vietnam, a group of 5 soldiers were assigned a reconnaissance mission. Their orders were clear: venture into a village that had been abandoned for months and confirm any signs of enemy activity. Captain Lewis, Sergeant Harris, Corporal Anders, Private Matthews, and Private Reeds prepared for their journey, each man weighed down not only by their gear, but by the oppressive heat and constant feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Stay sharp out there, Captain Lewis instructed as they made their way through the dense forest. The reports say the village is deserted, but we're not taking any chances. The journey to the village was brutal. The jungle around them was thick with vines and foliage, making every step a struggle. The sounds of insects and distant wildlife filled the air, but even those seemed muffled under the heavy blanket of tension. Every soldier had the same feeling they weren't alone. "This place gives me the creeps," Private Reeds muttered as he swatted away a large mosquito. "Why would anyone want to live out here?" Corporal Anders, who was walking beside him, nodded in agreement. "It's not just the jungle, something about this whole area feels wrong." Sergeant Harris, the most experienced among them, stayed silent, but his eyes constantly scanned the tree line. He'd been through enough strange situations to know when something was off, and this mission definitely felt different. There was an uneasiness in the air, a kind of quiet that wasn't natural. As they approached the village, the thick jungle started to thin out, revealing small huts and crumbling buildings that looked as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. The place was eerily still, no signs of life, no sounds, just the wind rustling through the decaying structures. "All right, spread out and check the area," Captain Lewis ordered. "Stay close, and don't lose sight of each other." The soldiers fanned out cautiously, rifles raised, scanning every corner of the empty village. As they moved through the overgrown streets, the silence became more oppressive, almost like the jungle itself was holding its breath. There were no bodies, no animals, nothing that indicated anyone had been here for a long time. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Private Matthews saw her. "Captain," Matthews called out, his voice slow but urgent. The others quickly gathered around as Matthews pointed toward a figure sitting on the ground, just outside one of the dilapidated huts. It was a young girl, no older than 8 or 9, sitting with her legs crossed and playing with small pebbles. Her dark hair was long and matted, and she wore a tattered dress. "What the hell?" Corporal Anders whispered. "There's no way a kid could survive out here alone." Captain Lewis furrowed his brow, clearly perplexed. "Could be a trap. Stay alert." Despite the strange circumstances, Lewis motioned for them to approach the girl slowly, their rifles at the ready. As they got closer, they could hear her humming softly, a simple, eerie tune that echoed in the still air. "Hey, little girl," Sergeant Harris called out gently. "Are you all right? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't respond. She continued playing with the pebbles, seemingly oblivious to the soldier's presence. "Something's not right," Private Reeds muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. Captain Lewis motioned for them to stop a few feet away from the girl. "We need to get closer. Keep your eyes peeled." As they inched forward, something changed. The humming stopped abruptly, and the girl's hands went still. Slowly, she lifted her head, turning to face them. But as she turned, the soldiers froze in terror. She had no face. Where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, like a blank canvas. The soldiers stared, horror-stricken, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. "Jesus Christ," Corporal Anders gasped, taking a step back. What the hell is that? Private Reed stumbled backward, nearly dropping his rifle. This isn't real, it can't be. The faceless girl stood up slowly, her head tilted slightly as if she was observing them. The air around them grew colder, and an unnatural, heavy silence settled over the village. "Fall back," Captain Lewis shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Everyone, fall back now." Without hesitation, the soldiers turned and ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. The jungle seemed to close in on them as they sprinted through the trees. The image of the faceless girl burned into their minds as they fled. None of them dared to look back, afraid of what they might see. The sounds of the jungle returned, but they felt hollow, distant. It was as if they had stepped out of one world and into another, one where the normal rules didn't apply. They didn't stop running until they were far from the village, panting and drenched in sweat. Captain Lewis finally slowed down, his eyes wild with confusion and fear. "What the hell did we just see?" he gasped, leaning against a tree. No one had an answer. The fear in their eyes said it all. There were things in this jungle, in this war, that went beyond the enemy, things they weren't prepared to face. "My grandfather told me," I continued, staring into the flickering firelight, "that after that first encounter with the faceless girl, the men were never the same. They thought they had escaped, but the jungle had other plans." The soldiers ran until their legs gave out, pushing through the thick undergrowth of the jungle. Exhausted and terrified, they stopped to catch their breath, huddled together in the oppressive heat. The eerie silence of the jungle had returned, swallowing the sounds of their frantic escape. Did anyone else see that?" Private Matthews asked, his voice shaking as he clutched his rifle to his chest. "That girl, she had no face." Corporal Anders nodded, his eyes darting around the trees as if expecting the faceless girl to reappear at any moment. "I don't know what that was, but it wasn't human. It couldn't have been." Captain Lewis, his breathing labored, was trying to regain his composure. "Everyone stay calm. We need to think rationally about this." "Rationally?" Sergeant Harris barked, his usually stoic demeanor cracking under the strain. "We just saw a kid with no damn face. There's nothing rational about that." Lewis knew Harris was right, but as their commanding officer, he couldn't afford to let panic set in. He looked around at the terrified faces of his men, each of them shaken to the core by what they had just witnessed. "We still have a mission," Lewis said, trying to sound authoritative. "We need to complete it." Private Reed shook his head violently. "No way. No way am I going back to that village." "We're not going back," Lewis reassured them. "We're heading deeper into the jungle. Command needs intel on enemy movements, and we have to finish what we started." The group exchanged nervous glances, but no one argued. The mission had been laid out clearly, and desertion wasn't an option. But the fear lingered, gnawing at each of them. Sergeant Harris stepped up, his eyes narrowing. "Let's move. The sooner we're done, the sooner we get the hell out of here." With that, the soldiers continued their journey, pushing deeper into the jungle. The trees grew thicker, the air more humid, and the oppressive sense of being watched never left them. It was as if the faceless girl's presence still lingered, haunting every step they took. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the jungle floor. The soldiers' exhaustion was setting in, and their nerves were frayed to the breaking point. "We need to set up camp," Corporal Anders suggested, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We can't keep going like this." Captain Lewis hesitated. Stopping in the middle of the jungle at night felt like a death sentence, but they had no choice. The men were too tired to continue without rest. "Fine," Lewis agreed, "but keep your guard up. We don't know what's out there." As they set up a small, makeshift camp, the soldiers worked in tense silence, every rustle of leaves or distant animal sound making them jump. The jungle seemed to be alive around them, whispering in a language only it understood. The fire they built provided little comfort, its light barely penetrating the darkness that surrounded them. They sat close to one another, rifles within arm's reach, their eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "That girl," Private Reeds muttered, staring into the flames. "What if she's following us?" "She's not," Sergeant Harris snapped, though his tone lacked conviction. "We left her behind," but deep down, every man there knew that wasn't true. The jungle felt different now, more alive, as if the faceless girl's presence had stirred something ancient and malevolent. "I don't like this," Corporal Anders whispered, his hand resting on his rifle. "This place, it's wrong." Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes behind them. Every soldier snapped to attention, rifles aimed at the noise. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then silence. They waited, hearts pounding, fingers on the triggers, but nothing emerged from the darkness. "Probably just an animal," Captain Lewis said, though even he didn't believe his own words. The night dragged on, and despite their exhaustion, no one could sleep. Every sound, every movement in the jungle felt like a threat. The tension was suffocating. And then, just before dawn, they heard it, a soft, haunting hum. The same tune the faceless girl had been humming when they first saw her. The soldiers froze, their blood turning to ice. The humming grew louder, coming from all around them, as if the jungle itself was singing. "She's here," Private Matthews whispered, his voice barely audible. "Shut up," Sergeant Harris hissed, but his hands were trembling. The humming continued, getting louder and louder, filling their ears, drowning out all other sounds. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, and then, out of the corner of his eye, Captain Lewis saw something that made his blood run cold. There, standing just beyond the firelight, was the faceless girl. Her head was tilted, and though she had no eyes, it felt like she was staring right at them. As my grandfather's voice trembled while recounting the story, I could see the fear in his eyes, fear that had followed him for decades. He said that night, the jungle turned against them, and there was no escaping what was to come. The soldiers froze in place as the faceless girl stood just beyond the fire's light. Captain Lewis's heart raced. There she was, silent, still, and terrifying. Without eyes, she shouldn't have been able to stare at them, but every man in that camp felt her gaze. "What do we do?" Private Matthews whispered, his voice trembling. Sergeant Harris's grip tightened on his rifle. "We shoot. Captain, we need to take her down." "No," Lewis hissed. "We don't know what she is or if bullets will even work." The fire crackled in the uneasy silence, and the girl tilted her head ever so slightly, as if amused by their terror. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she stepped forward one step into the light. The soldiers' breaths hitched. There was no mistaking it now. The girl was not human. Her skin, pale and translucent, seemed to shimmer in the flickering firelight, and where her face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. Private Reeds couldn't hold it in anymore. He screamed a sharp, desperate sound that echoed through the jungle. Before anyone could react, Reeds bolted, dropping his rifle as he sprinted into the darkness, away from the fire, away from the faceless girl. "Reeds, get back here," Corporal Anders shouted, but it was no use. The sound of Reed's frantic footsteps quickly faded into the night. For a moment, the girls had followed Reed's path into the jungle, her faceless void tilting as if watching him flee. And then, just as quickly, her attention snapped back to the remaining soldiers. Lewis raised his hand, signaling for the men to stay calm. "No one moves. We don't run. That's what it wants." The girl took another step forward. Private Matthews trembled violently, his finger hovering over the trigger of his rifle. "I can't take this, sir." "Hold it together," Lewis barked, though he'd have felt the paralyzing fear seeping into his bones. Just then, the girl stopped. The humming from earlier returned, soft, haunting, and endless. She began to sway, her arms slowly rising as if she were about to embrace them. "We need to get out of here," Corporal Anders muttered under his breath. "Now, Captain," Sergeant Harris urged, "we need to fall back." Lewis weighed their options. Staying put felt like death, But running blindly into the jungle was equally dangerous. They had to move, but not in panic. "We fall back, quietly," Lewis ordered. "No running." The men began to gather their gear, their eyes never leaving the faceless girl. The air was thick with dread, and the jungle around them seemed to close in, the trees and vines twisting like they were alive. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed from deep in the jungle, the sound of Private Reed's. His cries were desperate, full of agony. And then silence. Private Matthews started to hyperventilate, and Sergeant Harris had to grab him by the collar. "Keep it together, soldier. We don't leave anyone behind, but we have to move." The faceless girl stepped forward again, her movements unnervingly smooth, almost gliding across the jungle floor. Her arms outstretched, the air around her seemed to distort, as if the very space she occupied was bending to her will. Lewis could feel it now. This wasn't just a spirit. This was something ancient, something powerful, and it had claimed this jungle long before they had set foot in it. "We need to find Reeds," Lewis said, his voice strained. "But we don't split up. Everyone stays together." The group started to retreat, rifles raised, their eyes darting between the faceless girl and the dense jungle behind them. The trees seemed to twist in unnatural ways, casting long shadows that moved without cause. As they stepped further away, the girl didn't follow. Instead, she stood there, watching with her non-existent eyes, humming her eerie tune, letting them retreat for now. But the jungle had no mercy. Just as they began to think they were safe, a rustling came from their left, then another from the right. The soldiers tensed, realizing too late they were surrounded not by the enemy, but by something much worse. From the shadows of the trees, shapes began to emerge. Tall, thin, humanoid figures with faces just as blank as the girls. They moved silently, stepping out from the dark like they had been there all along, waiting. "There's more of them," Corporal Anders breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are they?" No one had an answer. The figures didn't charge, didn't rush forward, they simply closed in, their numbers growing with each second. The soldiers were being herded, trapped by these faceless beings. "Hold your fire," Lewis commanded, though his own hands were shaking. "We don't know what we're dealing with." But it was no use. Private Matthews, unable to handle the overwhelming terror, snapped. He opened fire, the crack of gunshots shattering the oppressive silence of the jungle. Bullets tore through the trees, but the faceless figures didn't flinch. They didn't bleed, didn't stagger, didn't even acknowledge the attack. They kept coming, their faceless voids turned toward the soldiers, their presence more suffocating with each passing moment. "Fall back," Lewis shouted. "Now, move!" The soldiers turned and ran, abandoning any hope of controlling the situation. They sprinted through the jungle, branches slashing at their faces, vines tangling around their boots, the faceless figures in pursuit. The jungle itself seemed to conspire against them. Trees loomed larger, their paths twisting in impossible directions, always leading them back to where they started. Private Matthews tripped and fell, screaming as the faceless beings closed in. Sergeant Harris tried to pull him up, but it was too late. The faceless creatures descended upon Matthews, their hands reaching out, their touch cold and final, and then silence. Lewis and the others kept running, their hearts pounding, until they stumbled into a small clearing. Panting, they collapsed to the ground, their bodies exhausted, their minds reeling. Matthews, Corporal Anders whispered, his voice hollow. They took him. Lewis stared into the darkness of the jungle, where the faceless figures had disappeared. They had claimed another one of his men, and there was nothing he could do about it. But deep down, he knew they weren't finished. The faceless girl wasn't done with them yet. The fire crackled low in the hearth as my grandfather continued his story. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he rubbed his palms together, his eyes fixed on a point far in the distance. "The jungle had taken us," he said softly. "We were no longer soldiers on a mission, we were prey. And those things, they were toying with us." The faceless beings advanced, slow but relentless. Captain Lewis could hear the labored breathing of his men behind him. Private Daniels was barely able to stand, and Sergeant Harris was dragging him along, his own strength nearly spent. The clearing seemed to stretch on endlessly, no longer the small patch of open ground it had once been. It was as if the jungle itself was warping, twisting reality to ensnare them. "We need to split up," Lewis said through gritted teeth, though the thought of leaving anyone behind weighed heavily on his conscience. "It's the only way maybe some of us can make it." Sergeant Harris glanced at the faceless figures closing in. His jaw tightened, but he nodded grimly. "It's a death sentence either way, Captain." "Daniels, Anders, with me," Lewis ordered, motioning to the two soldiers who seemed the most capable of moving. "Harris, take the rest and head east. We'll try to draw them away." There was no time for further discussion. The faceless entities were almost upon them, their silent, smooth movements sending chills through the soldiers' spines. Lewis broke into a sprint, and Daniels and Anders followed, the crunch of their boots against the jungle floor the only sound besides their ragged breaths. The humming grew louder, oppressive, filling their minds with an eerie melody that seemed to drown out any thoughts of escape. "Keep moving," Lewis shouted over his shoulder. "Don't look back." But, as they ran deeper into the jungle, it felt like they were going nowhere. The trees blurred together, the air growing thick and stifling. Lewis's chest burned, but he pushed on, his legs moving almost on instinct now. Suddenly, Anders cried out and stumbled to the ground. Lewis stopped and turned to see the soldier thrashing in the dirt, his hands clawing at his face. What that Lewis rushed to Anders' side, but as soon as he touched the man, he recoiled in horror. Anders' face was changing, warping. His features were melting, his eyes sinking into his skull, his mouth disappearing into a smooth, featureless void. "No," Lewis shouted, grabbing Anders by the shoulders, shaking him. "Anders, snap out of it." But it was no use. The transformation was complete. In place of Anders, there was now another faceless being, standing eerily still. The creature tilted its head, as if confused by its own existence, before turning and gliding silently back into the jungle. Lewis stood frozen, his mind unable to process what had just happened. A chill ran down his spine as the realization sunk in. "They're turning us," he whispered, horrified. "They're turning us into them." Daniels, standing just behind Lewis, was shaking violently. "We have to go. Captain, we have to go now." Lewis nodded, his hands trembling as he gripped his rifle. "We keep moving." The two men continued to run, the jungle seeming to close in tighter around them with every step. The air grew colder, and the distant humming began to echo in their ears, louder and more discordant, like 100 voices all out of sync. The faceless figures were nowhere to be seen, but Lewis could feel their presence all around them, watching, waiting. Without warning, the ground beneath their feet shifted. Lewis stumbled, barely managing to stay on his feet as the earth gave way to a steep incline. He and Daniels tumbled down the slope, branches and vines tearing at their clothes and skin as they fell deeper into the jungle. When they finally hit the bottom, the air was thick with fog. Lewis groaned, pushing himself up on shaky legs. His body ached all over, but he was alive. "Daniels," he called out, his voice hoarse. There was no response. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, scanning the dense fog for any sign of his comrade, Daniels. Then he heard a faint, raspy whisper, "Captain, help." Lewis's heart raced as he followed the sound, his eyes straining to see through the mist. He stumbled forward, his foot catching on something soft. He looked down and saw Daniels lying in the dirt, his face twisted in agony. But something was wrong, horribly wrong. Daniels's face was beginning to change, just like Anders's had. His skin rippled and shifted, his features melting away like wax under a flame. "Captain, please," Daniels whimpered, his voice barely audible. Lewis dropped to his knees beside him, his hands trembling as he tried to comfort the dying man. But there was nothing he could do. The transformation was unstoppable. In a matter of moments, Daniels was gone, Another faceless figure stood where he had been, its blank, featureless face turned toward Lewis, as if waiting for him to join its ranks. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late, he said quietly. I was the last one left. The jungle, it was alive with them, the faceless ones. Captain Lewis stood alone in the dense fog, the jungle suffocating around him. The humming had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that gnawed at his mind. Every breath felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was thickening, turning hostile. The fog parted slightly, and for the first time, Lewis saw the outlines of buildings in the distance, small, crumbling structures overrun by nature. His heart raced as he realized where he was, the village. He had heard about it from the locals, stories whispered around campfires late at night. A place abandoned long ago, left to rot deep within the jungle. No one knew why it had been deserted, only that those who ventured too close never returned. Lewis wiped the sweat from his brow, his body shaking with exhaustion and fear. His mind was screaming at him to turn back, to flee from this cursed place, but his legs carried him forward, almost against his will. There was nowhere else to go. The village was deathly silent. The huts, once homes to families, were now little more than skeletal ruins, reclaimed by the jungle. Vines crawled up the walls, and roots pushed through the earth, tearing apart what remained of the pathways. As Lewis walked through the ghostly remnants of civilization, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The faceless figures had disappeared, but he knew they were still out there, lurking in the shadows. Then he saw her, a small figure sitting in the middle of the path, her back to him. Her long black hair cascaded down her shoulders, her thin frame hunched over as though she were playing with something in the dirt. Lewis froze. It was the girl. The same girl from the clearing, the one with no face. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry as he took a hesitant step forward. His mind raced with questions. Why was she here? Was she leading him deeper into this nightmare? Or was she just another victim like his men? Hey, Lewis called out, his voice barely a whisper. Are you? Before he could finish his sentence, the girl turned toward him, and once again, her face was gone. The sight of that smooth, featureless had sent a chill through Lewis's entire body. But this time, something was different. The faceless girl didn't just sit there. She stood up, slowly, and began to walk toward him. Lewis stumbled back, his pulse quickening as he raised his rifle. His hands shook uncontrollably, his instincts screaming at him to shoot, but he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. The girl moved with a strange, almost dreamlike grace, her bare feet making no sound as she approached. Stay back, Lewis shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But she didn't stop. The air around him grew colder, the fog thickening, swallowing the village in an icy embrace. The girl was getting closer now, her faceless head tilted slightly, as if curious about him. Lewis's heart raced, his body frozen in place. Suddenly, the girl's hand shot out toward him. Lewis stumbled backward, trying to evade her touch, but it was too late. Her cold, lifeless fingers brushed against his skin, sending a shockwave of terror through him. In that instant, everything changed. Lewis's vision blurred, his mind assaulted by images and sounds he couldn't comprehend. He saw flashes of the village as it had once been, children playing in the streets, families gathered around fires, laughter echoing through the air. But then came the darkness, the screams, the blood. The villagers, all of them, slaughtered. Their faces torn away, their bodies left to rot in the jungle. And in the center of it all, the girl. Always the girl. She had been one of the first. Taken by the faceless ones, transformed into something else. A puppet, controlled by the malevolent force that had claimed the village long ago. A force that was now turning its attention to him. Lewis gasped, the weight of the memories crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His body convulsed as he struggled to break free from the girl's grip, but she was too strong. Her touch was cold as death, and it felt as though she was draining the life out of him, piece by piece. Let go of me, he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the fog. The girl's faceless head tilted again, as though she were studying him. And then, without warning, she released him. Louis fell to the ground, gasping for breath, his entire body shaking. The girl stepped back, her featureless face betraying no emotion, no intent. She watched him for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the fog, leaving Louis alone in the abandoned village. Louis lay there for what felt like hours, his mind spinning. The fog had lifted slightly, but the air was still thick with the oppressive energy of the jungle. He could feel it now more than ever, the malevolent presence that had claimed this place. It was ancient, powerful, and it wanted him. But why had the girl spared him? Slowly, painfully, Louis pushed himself to his feet. His body was weak, but he forced himself to move. He had to keep going, he had to find a way out. But as he stumbled through the village, something inside him had changed. The visions, the memories he had seen, they weren't just the past, they were a warning. And he knew, deep down, that the faceless ones weren't done with him yet. Grandfather paused, his eyes darkening as the flames reflected in them. I never wanted to return to that jungle, not after what happened next, he said. But some places, they don't let you go so easily. Captain Louis had barely managed to escape the faceless girl's grasp, but the jungle around him seemed alive with malevolence. The air had turned thick, almost impossible to breathe. He stumbled through the village, his heart pounding, not knowing where he was heading. The fog thickened again, swirling like a living thing. The trees seemed to close in on him, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. And then, the whispers started. Low, guttural voices that seemed to come from all directions. Louis, they hissed. Louis. He spun around, rifle raised, trying to pinpoint the source. But there was nothing. No figures. No movement. Just the endless fog and the suffocating silence of the jungle. He kept moving, his instincts driving him forward. His mind raced with the horrifying images of the villages past the massacre, the faceless ones, the girl. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were all connected somehow, that the jungle itself was a part of it. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet gave way. Louis fell, his body tumbling down a steep incline. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his ribs, but he managed to roll to his feet, gasping for breath. As he looked up, he realized he had fallen into a narrow ravine, the jungle walls towering above him on both sides. The fog was thinner here, but the oppressive energy of the place was even stronger. It clung to him like a heavy cloak, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to think. Then he saw it. At the far end of the ravine, half hidden by vines and moss, stood an ancient stone structure. It was small, barely large enough to be a shrine, but its presence was undeniable. The stone was cracked and worn, but strange symbols had been carved into its surface, symbols that made Louis's skin crawl just looking at them. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Louis, come closer. His body moved of its own accord, his legs carrying him toward the shrine. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though something unseen was pushing him down, trying to break his will. When he reached the shrine, he saw that it wasn't empty. A small, stone altar sat in the center, covered in thick moss and vines. But lying on the altar was something that stopped Louis in his tracks, a face. A perfectly preserved human face, pale and cold, its empty eye sockets staring up at the sky. It was her, the faceless girl. Louis recoiled in horror, but his feet wouldn't move. His body was frozen in place, trapped by some invisible force. He wanted to scream, to run, but all he could do was stand there, staring at the disembodied face lying before him. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their voices mingling together in a cacophony of madness. Join us, Louis, join us. The face on the altar twitched. Louis's heart raced as the impossible happened. The pale skin shifted, moving like liquid. The empty eye sockets filled with darkness, and the once lifeless mouth opened, its lips twisting into a grotesque smile. The girl's voice echoed in his mind, though her lips never moved. You can't escape. Louis's vision blurred as the jungle seemed to spin around him. His body felt weak, as though his very essence was being drained away. The energy from the shrine, from the face, was pulling him in, consuming him. "No," Lewis gasped, his voice barely audible. He tried to move, to fight, but the more he struggled, the tighter the grip of the jungle became. The vines wrapped around his ankles, pulling him toward the shrine, toward the face. He could feel the cold seeping into his skin, the darkness creeping into his mind. And then, he saw them, the faceless ones. They appeared out of the fog, dozens of them, standing at the edge of the ravine. Their smooth, featureless heads were turned toward him, their bodies unnaturally still. The girl was among them, her faceless form standing taller than the others, her presence commanding. They were waiting for him. Lewis's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. This place, this jungle, it was a prison, a trap for souls, and he was about to become its next victim. The vines tightened around him, pulling him closer to the altar. The girl's face on the stone seemed to glow with an eerie light, her empty eyes drawing him in. He could feel his strength fading, his will slipping away. "No," he whispered again, but it was no use. Just as the darkness was about to consume him, a blinding light erupted from the treetops. Lewis blinked, disoriented, as the light pierced through the fog, cutting through the oppressive energy of the jungle. The whispers fell silent, and the faceless ones recoiled, their smooth heads turning away from the light. In that moment, Lewis felt the vines loosen their grip. His body was free. Without thinking, he scrambled to his feet and ran, his legs carrying him as fast as they could. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from the shrine, from the faceless ones, from the nightmare. The light guided him through the jungle, illuminating a path that hadn't been there before. He ran for what felt like hours, his lungs burning, his mind racing with fear. But the faceless ones didn't follow. They couldn't. Eventually, the light faded, and Lewis collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. When he looked up, the jungle was quiet. The fog had lifted, and the malevolent presence was gone. He was safe. For now. Grandfather's voice grew soft, his eyes distant as he stared into the fire. "I never saw the faceless ones again after that night," he said quietly, but the jungle had left its mark. "Some places, they don't let you leave without taking a piece of you with them," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've told you this story so you know. So you understand. There are things out there, things older than we can imagine, and they don't care about us. We're just passing through their world." Grandfather fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.